So we're going to start with Michael, who'll give a bit of an overview about where we are now with regards to vaccine equity. And then we'll hand over to Isabel, who will give us a bit of, I suppose, a bit of insight into the knock-on effect that this is happening in reality on in the field and on the ground with MSF at the moment. We'll also have time for some questions and answers at the end. So, you know, if you do have questions during the session, please include them in the box below, and we'll get to them towards the end, or indeed we'll have time to open it up to the floor as well during that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Michael if you'd like to get started. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Jane Ann, and hi everybody. I hope you're all doing well and your skies aren't too grey. I'm just going to share this screen. I have a small presentation and hopefully this works okay. As Jane Ann said, I'm going to give a quick whistle-top tour through sort of the state of play in terms of vaccine inequity at the moment globally. And I'm going to hand over to Isabel. She's going to give us more on the ground perspective of what the reality is. And then I'm going to finish off by talking about the People's Vaccine Campaign and some of the things that we're trying to achieve with that. So just to give a broad overview about why a people's vaccine is needed. As we know, you know, the pandemic has been hugely crippling to health systems around the world, especially, you know, we've seen it in Ireland. It's been hugely challenging to well-resourced health systems, but obviously in low-income countries and even in middle-income countries, it's provided huge challenges in terms of them being able to provide basic services. And it's quite clear that vaccines especially are having a huge impact on reducing mortality and the seriousness of the disease. And while a lot of countries aren't having effective access to vaccines, that's continuing the rollover of the extent of the pandemic. And maybe if I ask people to cast their minds back, maybe 18 months, 2 years of where we were in Ireland with lockdowns, the impact that had on our economy, on our mental health, and on our health system when people were getting seriously ill, and they still are, but not in the same numbers, thankfully. And a lot more people were dying. That's what the situation is still in a lot of places around the world. I think the economic fallout is huge as well. We've seen that thankfully Ireland and other EU countries have been able to borrow loads of money to be able to help cushion that impact. But unfortunately, in low-income countries, again, they're having serious economic impacts. And they haven't been able to borrow at same cheap levels. So that's having huge impact, and many of them are looking to impose austerity, which so far we've thankfully avoided here. And for people themselves, especially for poor people, you know, this is just one more part of their struggle, and it's been interrupting harvesting, it's been interrupting supply chains, and I'm sure it's been the same with many of the people that you work with. People are more worried often in terms of those immediate impacts are being exacerbated rather than dying from COVID themselves. And probably the last point I'd like to make is the self-defeating nature of having a huge area of the world unvaccinated in terms of the possibility of new variants. We've seen what's happened with Omicron, and that had been long predicted by scientists and experts around the world, that having a large cohort unvaccinated increases the risk of new variants. And although we're all delighted and happy that, you know, Omicron hasn't been as deadly in many respects, it has moved through the system and in terms of its transferability. But I think the idea that that's the end now and we're not going to have more variants, or we'll just deal with variants when they arrive, is quite, you know, quite remiss. And the idea that variants won't arrive without anything changing is kind of wishful thinking. And it not only obviously has a huge impact in low-income countries, but that will have knock-on effects here. So what do we mean when we say a people's vaccine? We think that the fastest and most effective way to end this pandemic, because it's not over by any shape, there's still up to 5,000 to 10,000 people dying, there's still huge transmission around the world, is that everybody everywhere has access not only to vaccines, but to tests and treatment, which isn't available, as we know, to a lot of people in low-income countries. Pharmaceutical monopolies on the production and distribution of tests, treatments, and vaccines could leave countries in the global south waiting to be fully vaccinated till 2023 based on projections. And that's just a crazy, crazy situation. And as I said, it leaves us all in danger. The way we feel this can be addressed, it's not the only thing that has to be done, and I'll go into the other complementary measures. But there needs to be a worldwide sharing of COVID-19 related knowledge and technology in terms of the production of vaccines, treatments, etc. And we need to temporarily waive intellectual property rights. So generic versions of all those items can be produced in the global south, so they have a secured and long-term supply of all those elements. And also that it's provided at a transparent cost that's accessible to all people, whether they're frontline workers in Dublin or nurses in Delhi. And just to remind people, I know a lot of people will be aware of this, the extent of vaccine equity that we still have, despite the efforts and talk about this issue, we haven't really dug into this yet. As you can see quite visually, it's most low-income countries, and especially in Africa, that there's a lack of access to vaccines at the moment. And if we look at a global level, Ireland has probably one of the better vaccine programs in the world. 77% of the total population is vaccinated. In the globe, it's about 51%. So when I say fully vaccinated, I mean who has 2 doses. I'll talk about boosters now in a second. But 51%, that means roughly about 3 billion people, between 3 and 4 billion people aren't fully vaccinated, and 3 billion people haven't got their first dose of vaccines yet. So that's the extent and the size of the problem we're still facing. And if we drill down to it, we can see, where the disparity is. Obviously, thankfully for us in high-income countries, there's a huge percentage of the population vaccinated at the moment. It's 71%, which is quite high in terms of the eligible population. That would be close to 80 to 90%. The boosters are still a bit slowly. Ireland again has done well, but it's maybe up at 50, 60% of the total population, about 75% of the eligible population. And as we can see in low-income countries, it's a very tiny amount. It's still only at 5%. And in terms of boosters, which is now recognized as a gold standard, latest data coming out is that people have been boosted, especially with mRNA vaccines. It is really decreasing the impact in terms of how sick people are getting. And that's not to say people aren't still getting sick, but there's an awful lot less people in hospital, and thankfully a lot of people dying. We can still see the same in lower middle income and upper middle income countries. Thankfully, upper middle income have a high vaccination rate. Lower middle income are less than 50%, but we can see with boosters, it's still quite low on both of them. So you can see quite clearly the huge inequity, and I think it's really representative of not only resources, but power inequities within the globe. And we've really failed on this one. There's no other way to say it. Just a quick one on our booster rates, because that is where we are. Like, just getting your 2 doses isn't enough anymore. Again, the United Kingdom, Ireland are probably top of the class at about 50%. The EU is closer to 40%. United States between 30 and 20. But then if we look at the world, it's only about 10% of the world who've been boosted. And then if we look at Africa, low income, lower middle income, it's in the 1 or 2 or even less than 1%. So we have a huge distance to travel still. If we look at delivery rates, so this is how many vaccines have been delivered compared to the population. As you can see in high income countries, because we've been boosted and we've had 2 doses, it's roughly at about a little bit higher than double the population. But you can see in low income countries, it hasn't even reached the population level yet. Upper middle income and lower middle income, they're getting close, but that would only mean that 1 dose have been delivered per population, which isn't even up to the standard of people getting their basic 2 doses. So in terms of the human impact, this has obviously had a massive human impact. We talked about the economic impact, we talked about the health impact, but on a basic indicator of deaths, it's had a massive impact. So the official global COVID-19 death figure is about 5.6 million. But if you look at studies of excess deaths, because in a lot of countries, there's different ways of measuring them, and especially in lower income countries, not all the testing and the deaths are being recorded. So looking at various different indicators, I think, you know, well-respected publications like The Economist have estimated at least 20 million people have legitimately, we can say legitimately, have died of COVID, and probably over 20 million. So the real, what would I say, mortality impact of this has been huge around the world. And obviously it's been huge in countries like Ireland. Thankfully, we're not one of the highest, but it's been pretty devastating in a lot of countries around the world. The economic impact is also huge. There's been 137 million jobs lost. We know the figures about inequality rising in countries. We know the figures of poverty rates been rising, all the disruption to the economy, and that's continuing in a lot of countries. And it will take a long time to come back. We also know that there's a huge gendered impact in this, in terms of women, a lot of workers in the informal economy haven't got the support services or the social welfare system that we would have here. And also the care needs within society, with children taking off time, like in some countries, children have been out of school for 1 year, 18 months, 2 years. And that's usually, that gap is provided by women, and the same with caring responsibilities for more people being sick. So there's knock-on effects outside what would be traditionally seen as the health sphere. And as I've mentioned before, and it's not really part of the debate, is how to pay and how to cushion these economic, social and health effects. We've been really lucky. Our central bank in the ECB has facilitated really low interest borrowing, and it's meant that we can afford this essentially, and we don't have to go back to austerity policies. But poor countries are having to implement austerity, even though it's accepted in Western policy circles that this is a self-defeating policy. Many countries are spending more now on debt and repayments than they are on health services. So I'll leave it there, and I'll hand it over to Isabel, maybe to talk about what that looks like on the ground.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks again to Jainan and Dokas for having us here this afternoon. Médecins Sans Frontières has campaigned on access to medicines for over 25 years now, and the inequalities arising from the COVID pandemic are no exception, leading us to speak out and collaborate with civil society here in Ireland and also around the world. On the ground, our project locations and our teams are witnessing the direct and indirect effects that a lack of vaccines, tests and treatments have on the communities that we assist. Médecins Sans Frontières has run COVID responses in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even at the start of the pandemic in Europe, the United States and UK. We even had a very small response here in Dublin, where we supported SafetyNet in setting up mobile testing for vulnerable people. Not places where you would usually expect to find a big footprint of MSF's operations. As the epicenter moved around the world, we did too. But these responses, of course, were largely without mass COVID vaccination campaigns as a tool to mitigate the virus's effect. We had at one point 368 project locations with COVID-19 activities across 76 different countries. And 40% of these COVID projects also had a mental health component, which is a factor that we don't always think about when we talk about COVID-19. Our approach overall has been to adapt the projects at local level based on how COVID is affecting the communities and how we're working in conjunction with them. Currently in Syria, the ongoing efforts to contain the virus are obviously impacted by the conflict, but also by the poor access this causes to healthcare and the low immunization rate in northwest Syria. It's a region that has approximately 4 million people, and where at the moment, less than 4% of the population have been fully vaccinated. However, the low vaccination rates are not just due to lack of vaccines. Vaccine inequity starts with the supply, but it doesn't stop there. Other factors, such as cold chain limitations, short expiry dates, vaccine hesitancy within the population, lack of trained personnel to administer the vaccines, all these lead to a slow vaccine rollout. I'm sure many of the members here today will be involved with programs and projects on the African continent, which we know has a very low vaccination rate, somewhere approximately between 7 and 8%. Meanwhile, there are increasing evidence demonstrating that intellectual property issues continue to bring hindrance and uncertainties to the production of vaccine and medicines in many low and middle income countries. I was privileged a few weeks back to have a Moderna booster here in Dublin, as perhaps many of you or your families have also received. But in South Africa, Moderna continues to enforce its patent, refuses to share technology and manufacturing know-how with the World Health Organization Tech Transfer Hub, and potentially blocks alternative vaccine producers to come up with their own mRNA vaccines. Moderna's strategy is to retain decision-making power, being able to declare themselves when the pandemic is over, so it can enforce its patent and decide who gets the vaccine supplies first and at what prices. And this is not the first time that we have seen this strategy being employed by other pharmaceutical companies earlier in the pandemic. Now, under pressure, Moderna did announce that it would build its own mRNA production plant in an African country. However, given that Moderna still retains full control on production and supply under the proposed model, MSF don't see this as a step in the right direction, actually, in terms of the demand for full access or the transfer of technology to support local production and supply. With the onset of booster vaccinations, local production and supply has gained even more necessity as a sustainable model of being able to continue to provide sufficient vaccines in the longer term. There's still a lot about the COVID virus that we don't know. And we don't know, how often boosters are going to need to be repeated, for how many years, and so forth. And the TRIPS waiver is actually needed to facilitate this further and enable the scale-up of local production, not only for vaccines, but also for treatments and diagnostics, and the materials needed to produce the vaccines. There's also another example, a drug called baricitinib, which is quite difficult to say. This drug was previously used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, but it's now been repurposed as a therapeutic treatment for COVID-19. It's already widely patented in more than 30 low and middle income countries, which means that local generic productions are going to be at best hindered and at worst not possible at all. Fortunately, at the moment on the ground, our teams are seeing that the Omicron wave is resulting in a reduced need for emergency interventions, but the virus remains a real threat in countries where their healthcare systems are fragile and already overburdened, and vaccination rates remain low. As recently as a few months ago, we saw alarming and rapid growth in cases in multiple contexts, from Peru to northern Syria, resulting in, again, a serious strain on the local healthcare systems. And just more recently this month, our colleagues in Iraq have stepped up their support to the Ministry of Health in critical case management as the country undergoes yet another wave. Thinking about Iraq, there has been an increase again in their COVID infections since the start of 2022. And they have approximately 15% population vaccinated, but there is also very poor compliance with infection prevention measures. The Iraqi population also has high morbidity levels in chronic diseases, which are considered risk factors for severe COVID illness, such as hypertension, diabetes, lung disease, and patterns that are not actually maybe that dissimilar to what we see in Ireland. The key to our work in Baghdad is preparation of the health system to respond effectively to any increase in hospitalization rates. There has already been a lot of disruption to the regular healthcare services, which in turn impacts on patients with other conditions. And so we support Al Shifa Hospital in Baghdad to this effect, as well as other ministries of health around the globe. Just to finish off, COVID has actually touched us all and is by no means exclusive to the humanitarian context where we work, but it does make our responses more complex, and it certainly makes life even more challenging for the communities that we all work with. We see COVID's impact on the malnutrition rates. We see the lower levels of immunization for other vaccine preventable diseases. Its contribution to economic uncertainty, instability, and livelihoods, and how that plays out in areas of conflict where we're working maybe with many displaced people or people on the move. Equitable access to vaccines, diagnostics, and other treatments as tools in response to the global pandemic should not be about profits or affordability. As Médecins Sans Frontières, we can speak out about this, but as humanitarians here this afternoon, collectively, we cannot condone it. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. I'll hand back actually now to Michael to continue this before we open the floor. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Jane-Ann, and thanks, Isabel. So I'm going to finish up by going through what the response has been in Ireland and around the globe to this predicament. So I'm going to talk firstly about the People's Vaccine Alliance here in Ireland. So Oxfam Ireland and a number of other organisations, and you can see the logos. I won't go through the list because I'm sure to leave someone out, but it's a very broad coalition of INGOs, religious organisations, trade unions, doctors, medical organisations, academics, activists, and we're trying to persuade the Irish government to support both the TRIPS waivers, but also technological transfer initiatives by the WHO, like the CTAP initiative. And we've undertaken a number of different approaches. And I just want to share this video to give you an idea of the way we've tried to frame this. So hopefully this will share okay if you bear with me. apologies, folks. It's always the way when you've everything set up. And then, okay, here we go. Hopefully this works.
Can you share your screen again, Michael? Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's a little video we did for social media, and I think it explains our framing quite well. Hopefully, everybody can hear this, but if you can't hear it, there is subtitles.
A date with destiny tonight, a race that could make history. As rich countries hurry to protect their own people from COVID-19, the developing world must try to keep up. Normally a favourite, not this time. Just 5% of its population vaccinated. 9% South Africa's looking to break monopolies held by the big pharmaceutical companies. So countries like vaccines for themselves. Support the call to lift vaccines, but not Ireland, putting profit before life. Says Great Britain holding millions of doses more than it needs. The United States says it's in favour of leadership to that action. Surging and what's this agony for the developing world now to this race? They just can't compete. We all want to see an end to the pandemic until every country is vaccinated. The only winner is the virus.
So hopefully people were able to make sense of that okay. So I'm just going to go back to the end of the presentation now. If you give me 1 second. Here we go. So also we've engaged in some public actions. This is a protest that members of the People's Vaccine Alliance held outside Leinster House on the end of November. We haven't, like most organisations, because of the pandemic restrictions, really had a chance to do public protests. So it was important for us to have some symbolic protests outside Leinster House. And it really showed us that there was a lot of political support from this. We had engagement from practically all the opposition parties, and most welcoming, we had engagement from some of the members of government parties as well. We've been trying to influence public debates around this. As you know, COVID has been all over the news, and vaccine equity has been one of the issues and how you tackle it. So we've you know, had our own interviews, put our own facts out there, but we've tried to engage with Irish scientists and medics especially to put their opinion there and to try and use a facts-based scientific approach to it and try as much as possible to depoliticize this issue. And as you can see, we were successful in November having a big seminar with scientists and medics in Ireland, and about 350 of them signed a letter to the Taoiseach asking to support the TRIPS waiver and the WHO CTAP programme. We've also done a lot of political engagement, because obviously this will be a political decision whether Ireland supports this or not. You can see up there, that's the picture of the amount of signatures for doctors and scientists sent into the government. We were successful working with some senators, especially Senator Alice Mary Higgins, put a motion to the Seanad just before the Christmas, and we were really delighted with the approach she took. She took a cross-party approach. While it was critical of the government, it wasn't politicized, it was more looking at solutions. And a number of senators from all opposition parties co-sponsored that. And the debate, I don't know if people had a chance to see it, was really well informed and really impassioned. And a number of government party senators spoke for it. And the government had actually put a counter motion to block this motion, and they withdrew it, seeing that the support on the floor, especially from government senators. So it was passed ultimately unanimously. And it's the same type of approach we want to take in the Dáil. So we've been doing a lot of political lobbying behind the scenes, and we've targeted the Committee on Enterprise, Trade and Employment. This is the committee that has responsibility because ultimately the TRIPS waiver is a trade issue, and we've persuaded them to have a public hearing on TRIPS in the near future. We're just waiting for the details, and that will give an opportunity for international and national experts to present to that committee. Because often from our engagement, I think both from the opposition and from the government side, the politicians only have a top line understanding of the issues in relation to this. And hopefully that committee hearing will be able to provide a more informed response from that committee, and looking to maybe then having a debate within the Dáil about that and looking to move the government's position. Oxfam has also been part of legal challenges in terms of government's positions on the TRIPS waivers. We've been part of a 6-organisation petition to the UN to investigate the racial and gender discrimination from TRIPS. And we've also been working with a group of global jurists who've given their legal opinion that it undermines human rights obligations of countries. And I think it's a really hidden thing that really hasn't been talked about, the racial injustice and, you know, the racism of the way we're distributing vaccines, and the colonial approach, the idea that it's okay for rich countries to hoard more vaccines than they need and just give the leftover vaccines as charity to poorer countries. If we saw something like this in Victorian times, we'd be, you know, sniffing our noses at it. But this is the reality that's happening at the moment, and the racial implications of this and the racism underlying it isn't really being interrogated enough, I think. So I think we've gone through really what we're looking for. It's about getting rid of temporarily getting rid of the patent protections and ensuring that countries can produce generic supplies of vaccines, treatments, diagnostics, etc. And just having a look at this map, you can see where we are in terms of trying to get the TRIPS waiver. Most of the world supports it. The real holdouts are the UK, the EU, Switzerland, and a number of other small countries. And the EU, I think, is a key player. And that's why Ireland's role is so important, because although Ireland is a small player in the EU, when it wants to use its diplomatic weight, it can influence, whether we've seen it on taxation, we've seen it in relation to CAP. And we know that a number of countries are on the fence, and a country like Ireland using its diplomatic weight or using its public voice to question the EU's position on TRIPS, I think would have a huge impact. I'm going to quickly finish with some of the counter arguments that people may have heard. It will stop innovation, and I think this is a real red herring. You can see there from the visual that most of the financing for the vaccines has been provided by public money. And in general, pharmaceutical companies spend relatively a small amount of money on innovation. Most of it is spent on share dividends and on marketing. We have the situation during the HIV pandemic where a lot of these arguments were used in relation to generic production, and none of them came true. This is an argument that is used quite regularly by Ireland, that we should work with industry, and industry are doing a good job. And there's no doubt that the scientists who produce the vaccines, the role out in manufacturing has been phenomenal. And for a lot of countries, it's made, you know, a life and death difference. But the idea that industry will, you know, if we just work with industry, they'll do the right thing, I think is a little bit of naive and wishful thinking. It hasn't happened in the past. And there has been, you know, programs and measures that the WHO have set up, and industry just isn't interested. And there's a commercial reason for that. There's not a huge amount of money to be made in low-income countries. Their biggest market is rich countries, and that's where they're targeting. And I think, as Isabel has mentioned before, we have to remember history. The change in generic production from HIV, AIDS, didn't happen because of the goodwill of pharmaceutical companies. It was global pressure and public pressure in relation to that. And I think, unfortunately, the same is going to have to happen this time around. Then COVAX. So COVAX will solve the problem. So COVAX is definitely a really important short-term measure. It is filling the gaps in terms and providing essential vaccines to a number of countries. But the idea that COVAX will solve the problem and meet the supply gap is not based on any data. COVAX was meant to produce 2 billion vaccines this year. It's produced, or last year, but it mainly had 1 billion vaccines. And as you can see from this graphic, the huge gap between what's promised and what's been actually delivered. Most places have only been able to deliver half of their vaccines so far. And there's a key problem with this. When COVAX was first set up, it was meant to be a global, coordinating body where vaccines would be pooled globally. Instead, that quickly dissipated. The EU, the US, Canada jumped the queue and basically negotiated directly with the pharma companies for themselves, and often negotiated contracts worth more than they actually needed. And then we have a situation where whatever's left over then is being supplied to poorer countries. And that will continue to happen as we roll through boosters. So COVAX will never be able to meet that supply gap. And the other thing to be aware of, in terms of some of the vaccines being donated, and this includes from Ireland, it's quite clear now that the mRNA vaccines are the gold standard. AstraZeneca and especially Johnson & Johnson, we don't use here anymore. But we are donating those vaccines, and that is providing some of the challenges in terms of vaccine hesitancy. People know which are the right vaccines and the best vaccines to have. So that's a challenge as well. It's not to say that COVAX is an important part, but the idea that COVAX is the solution to meeting supply, as I said, it's just not based on any data. That their pharmaceutical companies on their own will produce enough vaccines to make gaps. And again, this isn't based on any, intense data analysis. The Financial Times, I think, did a quite good estimation of where we need to be this year in terms of boosters and double vaccines. And already in Q1, they were estimating a 3 billion shortfall in vaccines to vaccinate everybody in the world. And that goes up to, nearly 9 billion by the end of the year. So our existing system isn't designed to supply enough vaccines for the global population. The other argument that's used, well, that's all we have. There isn't enough extra production in the global system. Human Rights Watch recently produced a report documenting over 100 manufacturing sites around the world that could be easily and quickly retooled to produce generic vaccines for the global south. And two more, the EU is negotiating constructively. So the EU, and supported by Ireland, has put forward a supposed counter proposal, which is, to our understanding, just being used as a blocking tool to get the real negotiations about the TRIPS waiver. It doesn't really bring anything new to the table. It's looking at existing opportunities, mostly within the TRIPS agreement already, and they haven't been used by any countries, and there's good reason for them not being used because they aren't effective in increasing supply. And then maybe to touch on some of the issues, vaccine hesitancy. Obviously, vaccine hesitancy is an issue around the world, including in low-income countries. But from studies done, the level of vaccine hesitancy in low-income countries isn't any higher than what's average in Western countries. And in some countries, it's a lot less than it is in Eastern Europe. But supply is the issue in countries. And not just supply of vaccines, it's having an ongoing, what would I say, regular supply that countries can plan their vaccine program in advance. We've seen that countries have been able to do that in terms of HIV drugs, which are a lot more complex than vaccines. They're not once off, they're continuous, they have a complex mix. Generic production helps companies design programs to deal with vaccine hesitancy and to roll out that effectively. And in terms of distribution is a problem. There's no doubt that countries' health capacity, and especially low-income countries' health capacity, is a challenge. But this has been flagged very early in the pandemic, that countries will need financial support and other support to be able to effectively roll out their vaccines and other medicines. And Ireland has actually been quite good in that respect. While we would challenge their perspective on the TRIPS waiver, Ireland has contributed a significant amount to health strengthening in low-income countries. But it's really the system of how it's been provided that vaccines, what would I say, are going to waste both here and both in low-income countries because of delivery dates is a big issue in terms of countries getting them with a very low rollout time. But that's not to deny that distribution isn't a problem, but it shouldn't be a reason for blocking efforts to increase generic supply. You get a quick figure of the amount of wasted vaccines that have been got rid of in the West, and there's a few 100,000 that have been wasted in Ireland in a similar way. And another one that has been going around that it's not as a big issue in developing countries. And I think anybody who's been working on the ground will know that that's not a reality. I'd just like to finish quite briefly about what people can do. The obvious one is you can get involved and join our campaign. We have a petition. We would encourage you to circulate it among members to sign up. There's ways to engage with politicians on digital media. And political pressure ultimately is how this is going to be solved, but encouraging your members to contact their local politicians. And I think it's important that us as a sector, because I think Ireland's position on the TRIPS waiver is really letting down Ireland's reputation in terms of being a supporter of the rights of poor people around the world and a supporter of human rights. It's really letting down, you know, people are doing really good job on the ground by not giving them all the tools that they need. So I would encourage people to raise Ireland's position and challenge that at any appropriate venues that you're at. Thank you for your time and look forward to questions.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. I think everyone may agree that I think the presentations were really informative, I think, and also I know, Isabel, like you highlighted, you know, the fragile health systems, and I think we can really all resonate with that, particularly here in Ireland, you know, how the whole health system can be debilitated when it's overwhelmed with COVID and the knock-on effect that it has, and then particularly when we're looking at low-income countries, that result can be devastating for the communities there. I know we have a number of people on the call who are actually members of the People's Vaccine Alliance, and I think, Michael, that you showed there, particularly in those slides, the last few slides, which is very powerful in terms of the tools that people can use to actually counter a number of the arguments that are being put out by politicians here in Ireland or indeed at the EU level. If anyone does have any questions, please put them into the chat box or indeed any comments, because like that, I know many of you are very much familiar with the Alliance and might have something to say on what was presented here today. Perhaps, Michael, you could just, I suppose, some of our members are, you know, perhaps less health focused, or, you know, perhaps coming also from maybe not from a human rights perspective either, but are very much interested in kind of what they could do as part of the People's Vaccine. And you've mentioned a couple of things there, but it's really, you know, is there any other specifics, you know, in terms of what they can do as organizations to try to I suppose, participate in this and to try and mobilize and advocate for this as well?
I guess it's an open page. It's what organizations feel will work best in the spaces that they occupy. And in terms of engagement with the People's Vaccine Campaign, it can be as little as just joining the campaign and putting your logo and putting your name to it and doing and sharing our information. Or if you have more capacity, we have a number of working groups that's looking at public engagement and political engagement that people can work on at that level. And we have periodic sort of calls to action. So we're hoping in the next few weeks, there will be a public hearing on the TRIPS waiver in the Oireachtas. So we'll be sending out calls to action for people to tweet about it or to let their members know about it. And hopefully it'll be covered in the media. So if you do join us, you'll be put on the mailing list to be alerted to there. And as I said, use the opportunities that you have with influencing makers to raise this issue. But we're open to ideas. A lot of the stuff we've done has come organically from members, whether it's about protesters, like a new group has formed, Doctors for Vaccine Equity, and it's been very grassroots. And they've said, well, can we bring scientists together and get them to sign a letter? And they said, of course you can, we'll help you do it. Or can we have a seminar? So we're very much open to ideas. We don't have all the answers to how we can make this happen. And if people have any ideas, what would I say? We'd love to hear them.
Yeah, great. One question that's come through there from Olive just mentioned, that we're part of the, obviously Concern are part of the, I think from Concern, if I'm right, are part of the global campaign and have shared the campaign within their own offices worldwide, I presume, and some of those asks, and I think that is something that others can do also. But there is a question around, where would you, given the advocacy traction of the campaign already, obviously this has been going for at least 1.5 years, if not longer, where would you like to put your energy at this point? There's quite a lot of asks there, but where do you think there might be, at this moment in time now, 1.5 years down the road, where do you think it's best to focus the energy?
So within an Irish context, I would especially encourage people, the Committee on Enterprise, Trade and Employment, for that hearing to target members of that committee. And we will, as I said, be sending out materials when that happens. We want that committee to produce a strong recommendation to government. But then the key government ministers, the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, people may have seen the report in the paper about the Taoiseach today in the Times meeting pharmaceutical companies. That's one thing that we've struggled with. We've written a number of times to the Taoiseach, Minister for Foreign Affairs, and none of them have offered us a meeting on this. And I think that's telling in itself. So that's where the focus is within Ireland. But as various posters have put up, they're part of the global campaign, and Ireland is just one part of the picture. A lot of our effort is targeting Germany at the moment. Germany is a key actor within Europe, and they've been lobbied very hard by BioNTech. And the new government is an opportunity, we would hope, to bring some change. We know that the Minister for Health has been supportive of the TRIPS waiver, and there's a lot of lobbying going on behind the scenes. So if people have political contacts in Ireland, but if they're part of a global network that have, what would I say, connections in other countries, to be able to support that. Probably a big moment for us as well is the African Union EU summit that's coming up at the middle of the month, and we'll be doing some media and some reports in relation to that. And we are lobbying the French government because they're holding the presidency, and President Macron has been issuing, he's very good at issuing vague and contradictory statements about it being all solved at that summit. I suspect this won't be solved for a while yet. There still needs to be a lot of work within the EU to do this. So again, if people have EU offices, that would be very helpful. Great.
There's a comment there from Fibika, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, from the One campaign. Was that, one of the challenges is the narrative that downplays the COVID in Africa and suggesting that, immunity might be sufficient, particularly given Omicron's impact. And I think that there is, your presentation slide on excess deaths suggests otherwise. Is there more data, or do you think that is perhaps one of the ways to go to demonstrate, the kind of excess deaths data, and that angle would be one that could be.
Sure, and that's a really good question, and that's something that we have grappled with. And there's a professor in South Africa, I can share details. He's done some quite interesting research on this. I'll just remember his name. It sorry escapes me off the top of my head, but I've shared a document with Louise that she can share, and there's a link to his presentation. He's done research on excess deaths in South Africa, and he's correlated then to look at it within South Africa. And I can't remember the figure, but his estimations you know, he had a really sophisticated methodology of calculating excess deaths, and his estimations are 2 or 3 times the level of the recorded deaths, both in terms of deaths and in terms of incidence of it. So I can share that. I'd be really happy to share that, Edith. But there is an absence of data collection in totality. The ones in South Africa I think are quite robust, but for low-income countries in Africa, it's based on estimations, based on various factors, because the data isn't as robust, or the data collection isn't there. And I think that has to be challenged, the idea that it isn't that natural immunity will deal with this. We've seen people getting multiple doses of COVID, even if people were getting natural immunity. And I would, maybe a good argument against it is, would we accept that in Ireland, that, you know, we shouldn't have vaccines, we should try and all get natural immunity? We know that was the position of the UK government and how popular that was. So I'm not sure, but I'd be happy to talk with Tibika. I hope I've got that pronunciation correctly about this issue and others, and see how we can learn from each other.
Great, thank you. This might be one for Isabel, and just to mention, we will share the relevant presentations, indeed this video, and I think there was a suggestion there around MSF's recent presentations, the Oireachtas as well, so I think we could bring some of those materials together that might support some of our members, I suppose, in trying to look at how to move this forward within their own organisations. One question that might be perhaps for Isabel is just come through from Concern, who are engaging very much with ECHO on, you know, I suppose on the, I'm trying to get this correctly, I suppose that they were doing a stock take of kind of the vaccine support in Africa that's funded by ECHO, and some of the practical questions, I suppose, that they are being posed with in terms of issues about in-country supply, coordination, data management, vaccine cards. You know, and I don't expect you to have all the answers to that, Isabel, but it's more, you know, as part of the campaign, you know, of the People's Alliance, are you kind of addressing some of those kind of practical realities and how they can be circumvented, you know, in terms of the talking points and things like that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, sadly, I don't know all the answers to it. And I think the issues that Breda has listed there are common to many of the contexts that we're working in, and similarly, Michael's just been talking about the data collection, and you know, of course, many areas and countries in Africa, there's a lot of underreporting. The people don't, you know, possibly they're having to it takes many hours or days even to reach healthcare. Testing is another issue. How are the diagnostics being used? I'm sure that the number of deaths is well underreported, simply because, you know, people have just presented too late, or not presented at all, or there have not even been diagnostic possibilities to say whether it was COVID or something else. So yeah, the challenges are still very much in place, and you know, I think too, as Michael was also talking about supply, it just doesn't stop with the supply, and there's many more factors. Staff need to be trained. Staff themselves need to be vaccinated, and to be sure that, you know, the rollout and COVAX, when they receive the supplies, that it can be effectively implemented. So still, I think, you know, it's not all over, and these challenges are going to continue.
Yeah, thanks Isabel. And I think I know myself that, data, quality data is also very much part and parcel of the problem, and trying to ensure that you're accurately reflecting what the reality is as well. We are close to finishing up the session, but there was just one particular question here, or specific question, Michael, around is the People's Vaccine Alliance part of the team negotiating a new global accord to guide the response or to future global pandemics, or are you part of that at all?
Let me see. So I'll answer that, and I see Olive has one about the WHO. We're the People's Vaccine Alliance. I'm not sure. We're specifically focused on TRIPS primarily, but Oxfam is part of advocacy around the pandemic. What would I say? Treaty or whatever ultimate, and it's a worldwide initiative. But the length of time it takes these initiatives, it's going to be 3 or 4 years before such an engagement or such an agreement is signed off. So while we are looking at that and hope there's important points, something like tech transfer and TRIPS waiver need to be negotiated and agreed beforehand. Olive has a good question about the WHO. Yeah, I'm not sure, Olive. Like, the WHO have been quite strong at a global level in terms of saying that, supply is a big issue or one of the issues, and they've issued public support for TRIPS. I've noticed, though, when Mike Ryan is interviewed for an Irish audience, he's a lot more diplomatic and is not as strong as I would say on the TRIPS waiver. Obviously, he's trying to build relationships, but the WHO's position is quite clear that they're supportive of the TRIPS waiver, and that the issue of supply isn't necessarily financing. We need more money for COVAX. While that is we actually need more supply in the situation. So our international colleagues will be working closely with the WHO, but they've made their position quite clear.
Great, thanks. I think we will need to close off the session now. I gave my apologies to Breda. I'm sorry, and perhaps you could follow up with Michael directly after the session. I'm just conscious of everybody's time, but I don't know if you have any parting words, Michael, before we close.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to all people's questions, but if anybody wants to email to me directly with any questions or any points, I'll respond to them that way. But thanks for the questions, and thanks for your support. And yeah, when we get that public hearing, hopefully on the Committee of Enterprise and Trade, we'll be sending out an email to our members, but I'll also send it to Louise to circulate to DOCUS members, and there'll be a number of specific actions that you can undertake then in terms of putting political pressure.
Brilliant, thank you. Isabel, I'm not sure if you have anything else to add to that, or just to thank you as well for both your participation.
Thank you. I think this is probably a topic that Michael and I could talk about for a very long time. But yeah, if anybody has other questions, they can send them to us. And thanks again to everyone for their interest this afternoon and for having us to talk about our work there.
Brilliant, thanks so much, and we'll make sure to send all the documents and the session to everybody afterwards. So thanks for participating.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.